Every gambler knows that the secret to surviving.
I don't wanna take advice from fools. You always won every time you placed a bet. Money, that's what I want.
Joe Duffy, CEO of OffshoreInsiders.com. We're going to take a look at betting the conference tournaments. Yes, that's right, pre-NCAA Tournament, pre-Big Dance. Here are some do's and don'ts, and of course a lot of these apply not only in the NCAA Tournament, but even in some of those CBI, CIT, the NIT, etc. Number one of our golden rules about betting on neutral fields or neutral courts, you do not do what so many squares do and assume that it is a road game for both teams. Quite the opposite. We say time and time again, dictionary is a very important handicapping tool when it comes to March Madness. A neutral game is just that. It is neutral. It's not a home game for either team. It's not a road game for either team. In fact, the home court advantage is perhaps properly named. I would say it's about 55%. Home court is more good for buoying the home team than it is rattling or distracting the road team. But when we're talking about a road court disadvantage, that always changes in college basketball more than any sport as the year goes on. What you see is teams that are rebuilt, especially now in the era where the quote-unquote BCS teams or the power conference teams, their best players are leaving after their freshman, sophomore years, and their best players are newcomers. They're just coming in, blue ribbon, blue chip guys. They are teams that will actually start out with a pretty strong home-road dichotomy. They'll play much better at home than they will on the road at the beginning of the year. But they progressively get better and better, especially on the road. So some of the best road teams to bet against early in the year become teams to bet on late in the year. As their road power rating drops, their road quality actually increases. And just the opposite for teams that have a bunch of experienced players come back. Senior-laden teams usually early in the year make pretty good road teams to bet on, but then the rest of the conference, the rest of the country starts to catch up to them, and then their power rating goes up on the road, yet their quality of play starts to level off. It reaches a point of diminishing return. So I will go so far as to say, as anybody who handicaps neutral games in March Madness as if it's a road game for both teams, not only is it a myth, but it's counterproductive. And I will tell you flat out, if one handicapper ever tells you to handicap a neutral game, especially in college basketball, postseason tournaments, you want to run from that handicapper as quick as possible, because that guy is not a sharp. But anyone who does believe you handicap neutral games as if it's a road game for both teams, especially in college basketball, thank you for keeping the bookmakers in business for the rest of us. However, that does not mean that all neutral games are completely neutral. Over the years, I always like to compare news and notes with fellow sharps out there. And it's really about maybe 5 or 6 years ago that finally a sharp guy was telling me that he loves to see in neutral games how far each team travels. And when you have a big difference, especially if one team is traveling, say, more than 200 miles and the other team is traveling less than 40 miles or so, it turns out it's not a true neutral court. There can be a little bit of a neutral court advantage, and we definitely take a look at travel distances. Now, I'm not going to say that's as much of a gold mine as it is in the bowls. In the bowls, it really comes through, but most definitely in the conference tournaments, you're not going to see, in the conference tournaments quite as big of a dichotomy as you will under some other circumstances. Although now, the conferences are making less geographic sense than they ever did before. So just keep that in mind. Take a look at travel distance, and don't throw that out the window the first day. A lot of people would say, okay, each team, they already played a game. They've gotten settled into their location. Travel can be a cumulative thing, and it's not really at the top of our list of metrics. It's just one of those factors that's greatly overlooked. So if in day 2, for example, you've got two teams meeting that won in day 1 and they were both the more travel teams, don't all of a sudden throw this metric out the window. You don't want to overplay, it's not based all on travel, but I will say it is a very overlooked parameter. The new beginnings, we quote that Yogi Berraism, 90% of the game is half mental. If a team is underachieving, and especially they struggle down the stretch, often they get that mental break. They're like, all right, now we're starting all over in the conference tournament. So sometimes underachieving teams become pretty good value in the conference tournaments. That's not super high on our metrics, but it is something to keep in mind. Now, being counterintuitive more times than not helps you in sports betting. But one case where what seems to make sense is actually true. Depth is so much more important in the postseason than it is during the regular season. So you want to study those box scores from the night before when teams are playing back-to-back, sometimes back-to-back-to-back, and other times they're playing 4 games in a row. So if a team is, during the regular season, it's the Adrian Barbeau theory. You want top-heavy players. You want the studs, like Kansas, where they have 2 of the best players, maybe the 2 best players in the country. But come conference tournament times, there's where you really start to look at the number 6, 7, and 8 guys, and you want to see how many minutes a team, the key players, played the day before. Did they go into overtime? Was it close, etc.? So depth means a lot more in the conference tournaments than it does any single time of the year. The look ahead does not apply to both teams. Of course, when you're talking about a non-final game, each team that wins will be playing another game the next day. But it's the higher seeded teams where, if things fall into place, that they're generally going to play progressively tougher games each and every day. They're going to be more vulnerable to look ahead, where a big underdog, they don't have that luxury. So the underdogs are quite often the more focused team and a pretty good play under many circumstances in the first and even second round. And that is also where recent play becomes an even bigger factor. Remember in some of our other videos and our articles where we talk about how to weigh recent play versus the overall play, the recent form is so much more important now. Why? Because we tell you, you don't want to compare the same number of games, X number of games to X number of games. It is the X number of days, whether it's the last 5 days, whether it's the last 10 days. Now, say it's in the month of December where teams, their schedules are spread out. A lot of them take breaks for exams. The last 3 games, how a team performed, isn't quite as important when sometimes it's spread over 2.5, 3 weeks. But when you're talking about the conference tournaments where these teams are playing a bunch of games in a short period, recent play becomes more important than ever, especially our margin of cover, or we know, as we said, a lot of people like to call it the sweat barometer now, but the margin of cover or sweat barometer, whatever you want to call it, in recent games, we weigh that so much more heavily in the conference tournaments than we do during the regular season. And of course, you don't want to sleep, you want to surf. We're at an advantage. Remember, the sports books, the competition has become so heavy that they're trying to beat each other, putting out lines earlier and earlier. And true, we put out our plays as early as possible because we want to be ahead of the line moves. But when it comes again to these back-to-back-to-back games, sometimes some of the best sharp information is going to come out after the odds makers put the lines out. So keep that in mind. Use that to your advantage. If you want to have a March of Dimes, Joe Duffy's picks at offshoreinsiders.com. This is going to be our, I believe, 27th March. Well, it'll be our 27th anniversary on June the 1st of our plays being public, going way back to the score phone days. So for the best picks, not only in the conference tournaments, throughout March Madness, and keep in mind that the NITs and the CBI and the College Insider Tournament, a lot more. Each tournament we handicap a little bit differently. There's more intangibles that are involved in the smaller tournaments. Maybe if we get a chance, we'll do a video and discuss that more in depth. Please subscribe to us here on YouTube, or we're converting this into a podcast. You can subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, all that and more. The best thing to do is go to our webpage, offshoreinsiders.com, and subscribe to our Twitter feed because our podcast and our videos come out on that. But remember, offshoreinsiders.com is where you always want to be for winning picks. www.offshoreinsiders.com.